This conference will now be recorded.
Very good. Well, we'll give a warm welcome to everybody, and thank you for virtually attending this this webinar. And my name is Marcus Garnett. It's the first time I've moderated one of these, so ask for your forbearance if I get befuddled with the technology. I work with HRM, and I work with Sean Gillis at HRM Planning and Development. And Sean creates planning policy from the detailed site level all the way up to the region-wide level. He's worked in several communities across Atlantic Canada, and Sean's planning interests include transit, transportation networks, and regional planning. And he's especially interested in how transportation and urban structure interact. And he's a lot of fun to chat with. He and I often have discussions and debates about various transit-related topics. So I'm very pleased to introduce him and to welcome him as our speaker today. So we'll hand it over to you, Sean, and I think Sean will have a few questions for everybody to think about during his presentation. If you can put your answers into the chat box, and that way we can keep the presentation moving. And then afterwards, we'll throw things open for questions and answers and general discussion, which I will try to coordinate. So thank you again for coming, and we'll hand it over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Marcus. We have many fewer conversations these days since COVID. It's a shame on a lot of levels, of course. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcus. Marcus has been kind enough to send me some slides that he worked on for a similar presentation, and I've pulled a little bit of content there. You'll see it later. So I'm going to jump right in, and I've called this transit-oriented communities, specifically communities instead of transit-oriented design or development. And I think that because transit's a network and because people are traveling throughout a city or a region, you really have to think of the whole community at a big scale, as well as the kind of more detailed stuff. So I wanted to emphasize that right in the title. That being said, I will probably say transit-oriented development or design all the time. To some extent, they're pretty flexible terms. You've probably heard them a lot. You've probably used them. And so let's just get right into it. If my slides are going to go. This is always good. Oh, there we go.
Oh, yes.
Perfect. So people can put their answers in the chat box. We'll just give a couple of little bit of time there. What is the most transit-oriented city you've visited or lived in? And I have said city. If you've lived in an amazingly transit-oriented town, that's fantastic, but I'm guessing it won't be a town that people will answer. But we'll see if people are good enough to help me out and put some stuff in the chat box. That would be great. Okay, we're seeing Montreal, Montreal West, London, England, Canberra, Australia, Paris, Osaka, Copenhagen, okay, Barcelona, good, okay. So we're seeing a lot of Stockholm, Sydney, a lot of European cities, Beijing, East Asia and South Asia represented as well. Okay, so I'm gonna give you my list quickly. I haven't traveled as widely as some folks, but my list, Paris, right on top. There's no question for me. That's by a mile the most transit-friendly place I've ever visited. London, New York, Montreal, Toronto, Boston, Washington, and let's see if this works. At 143, a giant gap, Miami. If you've ever been to a very large Southern American city, not very transit friendly, just miles and miles and miles of low density development with highways together. So one thing that I think pops out for all of the things, all of the cities that people have mentioned, some of them are ones on my list, but These are all big cities with subways. That's great. Paris, London, New York, these are kind of the classic subways. The big problem when we start to think about that, most places don't have a massive subway network. And that's not to say that the places we talked about aren't transit oriented, but what else are we looking for when we're starting to talk about Atlantic Canada or frankly, most North American cities, most Canadian cities? What kind of things are we looking for when we talk about a transit oriented community? Because as much as I'm bullish on Halifax, I don't expect us to have a subway anytime soon or maybe ever, and certainly not a network. So, with that in mind, we're going for the D's of transit oriented development as a guide for our thinking. So, again, if people want to put some of the D's, some of you might know this, let's see what we get. People put them in the chat here. What, if you've heard of this, what are some of the D's of transit oriented development? Marcus, don't do this because you're, I know you know this. Density, density, okay. Wait a little bit more, see if anything else is coming. Density is one of them for sure. Going once, going twice, sold. Okay, we got 1 out of 5. I think if people were in the office, we'd get a little more, but density is definitely one. The first one that I have, distance. I call it direct routes. Other people, you'll often see it as destinations. Diversity, density, absolutely. Design, and demand management. Now, I've put these in order of what I think are the most important from top to bottom. And I think it's interesting that density came up first because I place it fourth. Not that it's not important, but you can do a lot of good transit-oriented stuff at moderate densities. But we'll get to that because it's fourth on the list. So I put my little tube signs to say that a lot of what I want to focus on today is the first two, distance, direct routes, because I think the design and density, I think we really are doing a good job on that as planners, and the diversity as well. That those three are sort of complete communities, good planning principles that we really do pretty well, and a lot of planners are really bullish on them. They get them. The other two, though, they work at a lot of different scales, and I think that's a good reason to talk about them. And they're also just so fundamental. The other three things, density, design, and diversity, cannot fix mistakes if the first two are wrong. They just can't. So, in some ways, walking distance is pretty simple. You have to be able to walk or bike to get to transit for it to be really useful. Yes, there are park and rides, but because cars take up so much space, they don't really scale. If you've been to Beijing or Paris or London, there's not football field sized parking lots around all the tube stops. That's not how people get there. They walk there, they bike there, or they take a bus or another tube train to get there. So anyways, walking distance, incredibly important. And this is not a hard guide. It's not a hard line. If you're at 402 meters from a local transit stop, you're probably going to walk, or you're probably just as likely to walk as someone who's 345 meters. But this is the guide we use. So 400 meters to local transit, 800 meters to rapid transit. There's a surprisingly little amount of literature on this. Actually, it's more of a guideline, but you can find some if you're looking for more detail. So what do we get from that in terms of the urban form? So this is a little bit of Marcus's terminology. When you have local transit running along a street and you have local stop spacing, so not very far, all of the catchment areas, the purple, that 400-meter walk radius, they overlap and you get a big long line of stuff you can easily walk to the transit stop, and that's your big long sausage, your 400-meter local transit sausage. When you have rapid transit, so you have a higher level of transit, often you space out the stations and the walk radiuses don't always overlap, and you get the pizzas, as Marcus calls them. You can also hear them called pearls on a necklace. And if you look at cities like London, like New York, Boston, ones that have old, very well developed commuter rail legacy rail networks, you'll often see this pattern extending out into the far, far suburbs, dozens, perhaps more miles from the center of the city. So one of the big goals is within that walking distance is to put a lot of good stuff, fairly basic. You need to be able to walk to transit. You want to be able to get to a lot of stuff, which clearly will get into our density and diversity as we go further along. This one I think is pretty important. When we think about it sometimes, often we'll focus just on the station area, which is good, or the stop area, also good. But when you think of at a more regional or neighborhood or citywide scale, your transit lines are made up of lots of different stops or stations. And if you have big holes where there's way too much distance, people have to travel further and you have to run all that service. And this is an example from Montreal. If you're actually building hard infrastructure, you've got to build a lot more of it. So in Montreal right now, they're building a light metro, so think SkyTrain, and it's going to go onto the South Shore from downtown. And the red in this is what's almost built and probably in 8 months going to open. And the dashed line is, I've just seen it kind of talked about in the news and in some urbanist sites. Well, what if we extended to Chambly, 11 kilometers away? There's nothing but farmland between Chambly and the other end of the line. So you're spending well over $1 billion to serve 50,000 people. This is kind of an extreme example, but you hear a lot of suburban expansions pitched. Well, what if we just made the line go further? Well, what if we had to operate that? We had to maintain it. We had to build it. The numbers add up quickly. Also, those people from Chambly have a fairly long trip, even at a good speed. So distance is both walking distance to the transit, very critical, but also distance to other destinations. So both of those are critical, especially number 2 at the regional scale. So this is a little bit of a joke, but not entirely. So the shortest distance between any 2 points is, I won't leave you in suspense. Oh, go back there. It's a straight line. Makes sense, right? Basic geometry. If you're trying to travel quickly, you want to be going in straight lines. And that kind of underlays a lot of the geometry of transit, that really simple idea. Direct routes means broadly straight lines. And I point this out for a couple of reasons. Unfortunately, that gets missed at some scales, which we'll talk about a lot, but also because a little, and this is just a small side note, this is another of Marcus's slides that I've changed up a little. And it says in here, you can see one of them, this is from Ford Motor Company, crowdsourced, dynamically routed shuttle service. So what I think they mean by that is that you pick up your smartphone, because it's all about technology, and you dial in where you are, and the bus or shuttle or whatever vehicle comes to you when you want it, and you go on your way door to door. There's a lot of good things about that, but there's a lot of things to consider that could be problematic. And I think the simplest one is, if you've got the top of my little diagrams there, this would be your fixed route bus service. You walk out to the stop, you get on, and you go where you're going and get off and usually walk. With a dynamically routed shuttle service, where are you going? You know, if we're talking about freedom, where are you going? Because someone else is dynamically changing that as well. So this is just a small aside. When you hear people talking about dynamic routing or crowdsourcing or demand responsive, all of this, there's a time and place for it. But for your transit-oriented communities, you need something more substantive for a lot of reasons. So just a caution there. Something more fundamental. So this is from Jarrett Walker. For those of you lucky or unlucky enough, depending on how you see it, to talk to me about transit, I always talk about Jarrett Walker. I think his work is totally fundamental to everything we do. It's really great. He's got a book, Human Transit. It's that thick, but really great. And he's also got a website, humantransit.org/basics, and he's got wonderful stuff. So now that I've fulfilled my contractually obligated pitch to Jarrett Walker, I will put his big idea for land use planning here. And it's very simple. It's called Be on the Way. You want to be on the way to good stuff because then transit can serve you on the top in a direct and fast service. Very critical. If your service is more like the one on the bottom, then you have detours. So if you want to go from end to end, you're making all these detours. Very frustrating as a rider. Your transit agency is not going to be super thrilled by the bottom because they have to spend all this extra service because the line is now longer. All of these problems arise from people not putting things in relatively straight lines. And that's really the key message. It's just as simple as that in some ways. Nice straight lines, nice and long across lots of good stuff. And of course, pack good stuff into those stop areas when you can. So that leads to some really bad shapes that you sometimes see for transit routes. And I've tried to give them silly names. The one on the left is the nose. We've got the tree, and we've got the one-way loop, which isn't a silly name, but loops in general just are not great for transit because just think of your own travels when you want to get somewhere, not when you're sightseeing. Do you generally travel in a circle or something like it? No, you take a relatively direct route because you have a purpose. Your time matters. And then, our suburban style routes where you have some sort of squiggle and the transit planners are just trying to get through that neighborhood because, wow, the planners just failed to give them some good routes. So there are certain bad shapes for transit. If you're designing things and you start to see these kind of shapes appearing, that's kind of a warning sign. And to a certain extent, these extend across a lot of different scales, down from the building scale. If you're too far from the street, then you have to make your walkers, your riders, detour a little bit to get to and from the stop. Not as drastic as if you have a 500-meter long cul-de-sac, but still be an issue. So I'm going to look at this in some detail, but let's picture we have a road and we've taken scale out of this. You've got a nice straight route. We will agree, imagine in our mind that there's transit supportive land uses at some transit supportive density near this straight route. People can go to and from it all day. Awesome. And we do this. We put two roads off it. They're now perpendicular. So we have, well, two big choices. We can continue the straight route, or we can add a route like this. Huge detours. The people trying to travel end to end on the route are now frustrated because they've been pulled off their way. Takes a lot longer to travel everywhere. This is also way less intuitive. You just had a straight line. Now you have this. And we'll show you some real examples. This is real life. I deal with this, on the daily, unfortunately. But what you've actually ended up creating is this kind of question in your mind. So if you stick with just the red route, and now we've added some scale, this is our walk distance to the stop. These people on these big long routes, you can look at it two ways. They either have a very long walk or they have no transit service. And that is a spectrum. There's no just line where you all of a sudden don't have transit service and then another side of that where you do have it. But I think what's really critical too is that the people who don't have service, it's very tough to tell them, well, you're at a low density and on a detour, therefore you don't get service. There's huge political pressure to put routes into these types of areas. So you create a whole host of issues by doing this, and your transit agency, I'm guessing, will never thank you. So let's move out to a bigger scale, actually, and be on the way at all scales. So if we're looking at Highway 3 and Highway 103, for example, in Nova Scotia, we have some reasonably sized communities: Chester, Mahone Bay, Bridgewater, Hubbards, Timberley, Halifax, all in a straight line. We can imagine that people want to travel between them, again, in a relatively straight direction. So the problem, let's see if this works. Yep, there we go. Poor old Lunenburg. Now, in the 1760s, when Lunenburg was founded, the planners could not have considered this problem. And this is something fundamental to where these places are located. So I just show it that you can serve Lunenburg with transit, but it either needs its own separate route or there's a giant detour between Mahone Bay and Bridgewater. both of which are not super ideal ways to service these communities. And there's nothing we can do about it. We have to make one of those choices or some other thing. That's just the way it is. This is just an example that this can happen at all sorts of scales. Going to go to a town that I know pretty well. My family's from around Antigonish, and I went to school at St. Avex. So another example, so the Trans-Canada Highway now bypasses Antigonish. Like so many other towns, the highway keeps moving farther and farther away from the town. Now you can imagine that as a university town, St. Avex drives a lot of ridership for Maritime Bus. New Glasgow, Antigonish, Cape Breton, that serves a nice straight line, except that at this, I guess, town scale, any bus that wants to get off the highway and go service St. Avex probably has a 12-minute detour to do that. Not the end of the world, but Maritime Bus already has enough struggles as is that these kind of things just make it that much harder. So again, this is just one example, but I think it's, to me, it kind of suggests that you could look at all of these, you could look at a lot of these around HRM, around Truro, Kentville, what have you, but controlled access highways are really, really great for motorists, but they pull transit way out of the way of the communities they're meant to serve. So often when you have highway infrastructure, what you're asking your transit planners or your land use planners to kind of solve together is, what do we choose? Do we choose the straightest, fastest route, or do we choose getting really close to people? And those aren't great trade-offs to have to make. You get suboptimal services that way. Getting a little more into the city scale, this is St. John, New Brunswick, where I worked I didn't work with the city, but I worked in St. John. I worked there for 4 years, and the main road, which is Loch Lomond Road, if you go left or west, you get into the city of St. John. If you go east, you get to the airport. So there's transit service here connecting two important locations. All of these roads off of this road cannot effectively be serviced by transit because of what we looked at before. You're just detouring so hugely to get there, or it's too far from the main road for people to walk out. So these kind of things, these kinds of places, regardless of what density they had, regardless of the land use, not great for transit, transit hostile. So I guess my main message at this point would be that the parcel location is the biggest thing determining if what you build can be transit friendly.
Yeah.
Or, as a friend of mine kind of puts it a little more snidely, TOD is not about Adirondack chairs and sidewalk cafes. It's not about the site level design so much as what you do. Where are you in the region? Are you close to other transit? Are you close to other destinations? What's the road network like? So all of these things, planners want to keep them in the back of their head all the time. So this is of course, randomly chosen location in Halifax. And for those of you who don't know Halifax as well, this is near this is near Bears Lake Industrial Park. So you can see Highway 103, Highway 102, and you can see the various roads leading into this location. So my question is, and again, let's use the chats, see if we've got stuff coming up. What do people think of this as a transit friendly location? Does this work? I'll see how long this takes. Just don't want to tie it up too much. What do we see here that is good or bad? Okay, I'm gonna jump in, and the first thing that to me is a big red flag is this is on the edge of town, and that isn't necessarily. It's not on the path to where people are going. Kevin put that on. That's perfect. There's nothing much beyond this. It's not on the way. So if we go directly west, not good, not central, absolutely. A great spot for a hospital. Adam, fine. I mean, it's a hospital out there, really. Didn't know that. It's not on a transit corridor, absolutely. The chat's coming in now. There must be a little delay. Cool. All of these are great. They're perfect. So if we look into this a little more, if you look directly west, that's urban reserve land. There's nothing there we don't foresee anything happening in the next 15 years potentially. So that could change, but as of now, that's nothing. If we look directly to the north and you see the yellow, that's a regional park. There's nothing changing up there. That's going to be woods forever. I love our regional parks. They don't generate much transit ridership. Even at the entrances, they're not just going to do it. They're not dense. And then if you look directly south, you've got a lake. So you do have stuff to the south, but you're not going to be able to access it by a direct route because you've got a lake in the way. Are we going to build a bridge over that lake to make a straighter line to the industrial park? No. And then right in around it, people who know Bears Lake, loopy roads, very few connections, a lot of different problems. And yes, this is the location of a new hospital. So and I remember when this was announced, there was a lot of social media chatter and people from the province were saying, well, what's the problem? We'll just pay for buses for you. And it's like, this cannot be easily fixed. It may not be fixable actually. So you have a place that's going to generate huge amounts of transit demand that cannot be adequately serviced. Maybe in dozens, 50, 100 years we can change this, but the medium term, not looking good. So anyways, let's not belabor that point. I'm going to see if this goes here. Just waiting for this to move along. Okay, let's see. Sorry about this, folks. I guess while I try to make this go, it might be a good time to open up. If anyone has any questions, either put them in the chat box and I'll see if I can respond, or perhaps we could even have a little chat. And this is just, for some reason, it just stopped. Okay, just a second here. Jay, do you have any ideas? Has this happened before on your end?
I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to advance my slides and it's just not doing anything. And I can't.
Would be something involving your computer.
Okay, can you let me not present for a second, please?
Yeah, maybe while you see what you can do at your end, Sean, I mentioned, but I was just stunned when I heard that was where the new hospital was going to go in. Of all the places it could have gone, it was probably the worst in my mind. It doesn't even look to me as if it would work too well for car drivers, because it's not even near the interchange. You've got to drive through part of Bears Lake to get there. I think what the province had in mind was trying to make it convenient for rural people coming in. But of course, that only works if you're coming in from the west side of HRM. One of the things that I did hear is that it will be more of an outpatient hospital, and we're not going to be forcing everybody to go off the peninsula out to the boonies to be treated.
It's working here. Am I presenting now? Sorry.
Don't see your screen there yet, Sean.
Okay, let me.
One other thought about this too is, given that we have a teaching hospital a medical teaching hospital, there's going to be a lot of interns, and some of them are going to be posted to work out in Bears Lake. A lot of them won't have cars yet. How are they supposed to get between their classes and their internship? So it seems to me that these things have not been adequately thought through.
I'm gonna try to share my screen again. And you're gonna see my presenter view, folks, because it advances when I do this and it doesn't otherwise. So
Okay.
there you go. You've got all my notes. That's okay. Okay. Thank you, Marcus, for filling some dead air. I would agree 100% with Marcus. It just speaks to, I think it speaks to the huge cultural, institutional, and political barriers that land use planning and transit planning faces. It's really difficult. So I think a lot of us have concluded that we could have in 12 seconds named 6 or 7 better locations for transit that also would have been well accessible to highways. So it's very disappointing. And the most disappointing thing I think is that as a land use planner, I often have myself and my team, all of us at HRM, but other places we've worked and with council, we only often have partial control over decisions, because when developers are spending big money or private capital's involved, they have other things they want to do other than what we want. But in this case, it was the government. So you had a lot of control over that decision. Anyways, let's not raise everybody's blood pressure again. I deliberately chose that location for that purpose. It was pretty obvious, I think, to everyone out there. So, but to me, that is the decision that just hammers it home. It's not on the radar at a lot of different political levels and a lot of different professions. So we'll move on to what I would call, and this, people are seeing my slides, it says transit hostile locations.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. So warning signs, not absolutes, but kind of warning signs for transit hostile locations. So you're far from the center of town, you're far from other destinations, you're placed off a main road, it's a detour to get there, you're not on the way, you're few direct street connections, one way in or one way out, not much beyond this location, not much planned, and highway infrastructure. If you're next to the highway, not necessarily going to be transit oriented location. And that's not meant to say that you can't do TOD if some of these are present, but you get too many of them, you just start wondering if the briefs from all the people who want these developments that they're trying to pitch happen and are using probably words like transit oriented development, are they just greenwashing it?
Yeah.
It happens a lot. I've seen a lot of stuff described as transit friendly that is nowhere near it, but that's a topic for another day, or maybe not. Okay, so let's look at some examples again. So this is Missoula, Montana, excuse me. I got this example from Michelle Poyero, who gave us a talk a couple of months ago. We were chatting about it. And so Missoula is a college town, about 120,000 people. And so that's a decent sized place. That's Moncton, St. John. That's bigger than Fredericton, I believe. So it would be the fourth biggest city in the Maritimes. Highway 93, you can see it running right down there. That is, let's see sorry. Okay, so Highway 93 is a stroad. And for those of you who don't follow strong towns, it's very good. And also they use the word stroad as a portmanteau between street, which provide lots of access, and a road, which provide lots of movement. But a stroad is a bad combination of both. It doesn't really do either well. Stroads are often your old time commercial strips, your big box power centers. So in this case, you've got going right down the center of town, Highway 93, and it connects the north side of town, which is actually north of the, kind of runs off the map, with downtown and the center, which is actually kind of south, a little bit off the map, and some stuff in the middle. So in the red outline, you can see a new urbanist development that was built, and the nearest it is to the road is 400 meters. So that your walk distance, best possible scenario, is just beyond the edge of this otherwise very well designed development. And again, there's nothing beyond it. There's nothing really to the south of it. And whatever that bright blue thing is, some sort of quarry, I don't think that's redeveloping anytime soon or easily. And my favorite thing about this, though, actually, is that if you look, there's an elementary school, which is, again, as far as possible away from anywhere you're going to put good transit. It's actually called Hell's Gate Elementary. I think that's phenomenal. But this is an example where the natural place from a development point of view is where there's empty land that I own it or the developer owns it. The natural place to put lots of people is unfortunately on the much maligned Strode. So in this case, be on the way would actually mean be on the Strode. So at the highest level, I guess what I'd say is your location plus your street layout creates your transit options. And that goes across a lot of different scales. And we'll look at some of those. So an example from Halifax, this is Goggin Street into Barrington Street. Grids are great, especially when those main streets extend far, far, far across the grid. In this case, you've got a whole lot of good stuff. I won't belabor the point. I think this kind of speaks for itself. Lots of good stuff on a straight line. If we get down deeper, this would have all of the other things like density, diversity, and design supporting it. Going to look at a little less ideal scenario. So this is also HRM, excuse me. The blue line is Portland Street, and the red is Mount Edward Road and also down to Woodlawn. If you were to travel left or west on the blue line, you'd come into downtown Dartmouth. So a kilometer or two from where this map ends, there's tons of good stuff, also where you head over to Halifax. So Portland Street itself, the blue, great straight line, Mount Edward Road, nice and straight. The problem, of course, is all of these other things that you're trying to do. So first off, your bus stop, the red one I've highlighted, your 400-meter walk distance, the actual distance to walk, not the radius of a circle, doesn't get you deep enough in here. So what you're forced to try to do, and these aren't the actual Halifax Transit routes, I don't believe. These are just me scribbling to try to get in there. You can see the problem. They're not straight. Another key thing that to note, and a lot of talk goes into this, so we're generally on this as planners. But if you look at that, I guess the smaller one where I've just drawn the 400-meter line, that street network doesn't let many of the people able to get over to that line. So no matter which one of these streets you choose, you're choosing not to service someone on the other side of that loop. So you have huge problems with this. Again, from a political point of view, from an equity point of view, from a fairness point of view, you can't not give these people transit. But you have to do a lot of gymnastics to try to do it. So we will add to our bad shapes for transit routes, things like this. So what would you want to do? And I've drawn in the light blue where it would be really great to have a collector road. I think the ship has probably sailed on this. I mean, to try to expropriate all these properties, you're not going to be able to do it. But this simple collector route, being put in place 30 or 40 years would dramatically change the possibilities for transit for all of these people for the better. So at a high level, you're looking for straightish collectors. You don't need a gridiron. 800-meter collector spacing, again, so you can have your 400-meter walk shed on each side, and pedestrian routes galore. And this is where your kind of more small-scale grid for pedestrian routes comes in. It's good if a lot of them are also for cars, but the pedestrian's really critical. And if you make it friendly for bikes, well, hey, A+, that's great. So we've gone through 2 of the Ds of transit-oriented development, hopefully not in too much agonizing detail for people, but to add a little more to this. So we're saying distance to transit and to other destinations, and direct routes to a variety of useful things. very critical, and also very critical to plan early, because once the development starts to come and people are trying to put in roads, you have to have the plan there, or else you may not get them. Diversity. Marcus sent me this slide. This is great. Marcus, were you very hungry when you were putting together the presentation? Diversity. You want to cluster a lot of different stuff near transit. Fairly reasonable. This comes back to, again, the good community design that we talk about a lot, Jane Jacobs and the new urbanists. And when we're building those pizzas, we want to build works pizzas. We're not just building cheese pizzas. Mix up the ingredients. So again, though, at the stop level, that's one thing. We've got lots of good guidelines for that. We're doing good work as a profession. Also on each line across the network. So the top, we have maybe your ideal 1960s, 70 regional level planning, very simplified, where you have everything separated, and that starts to affect your transit line. Or on the bottom, you have many more mixed uses kind of spread across at the stop level, but also across the network and across the line. So the bottom is what we're going for. That's really what we want to do. And again, this is the kind of muscular regional level planning that, unfortunately, I think as a profession, we got really scared off by after some of the debacles of the 70s and the 60s. So I hope we're getting back to it. This is kind of the goal. Density. I'm going to fly over to Germany for a variety of reasons. I started looking at European cities to try to figure out, why were they so much better than us? And density is part of it, but this is the city of Hanover. The urban area is 72,000 people. The metro area is 1.2 million people, so we're broadly comparable to Ottawa, not too far off. It does have a higher density than Ottawa, but not hugely higher. And if you think of Ottawa, it has a lot of great stuff in the center, a lot of really good transit-oriented stuff in and around Ottawa. What I want to show with this is a number of things. So this is the colored lines are the S-Bahn, which is a grade-separated regional rail. So in terms of the service, it's commuter rail, but better. It runs through the whole day and it runs at better frequencies. So this is a metro area of 1.2 million people comparable to Ottawa, and there's its regional rail network. That's impressive. I'll also point out that the U-Bahn, which is the urban light rail, there's 7 or 8 lines closer into the city that aren't shown on this map just because of the scale. So basically, Hanover is beating Ottawa to a pulp in terms of how much good transit it has. And this is reflected in how many people use transit and how many people get to work by transit in Hanover, much higher than comparable cities in North America. The point here, though, is that the density in Hanover is not super high. They've just arranged things way better than we have for many, many, many years. And yes, Germany's cities are much older than ours, but until 70, 80 years ago, they weren't that crazy different. We've just gone a very different route since around, the 1940s. But I'm going to zoom in. You can see the arrow for Hamlin, and I'm going to zoom in and kind of close the circle on design. So we've zoomed in to one of these peripheral stops. So Hamlin is about 40 kilometers straight line from Hanover. So this is the station area. So you can see to the left, they've got their little downtown. And this is where we're getting into the stuff that, the new urbanists love, that the urban designers get really excited about. And this looks gorgeous. This is great stuff. I love it. Tight blocks. You've got a very walkable street wall. If we zoomed in, we'd see these buildings are 2, 3 floors. The density is about 6,500 people per square kilometer in that area, which would compare with many areas of Clayton Park West. But everything is totally different. The design, the direct routes, the diversity are all so much better, and the package works so much better to support transit. I'm going to flip over actually to the other side and look at the industrial land uses over here, which you can see. And I've just drawn a couple of things that I think are really critical. So interesting. So we've got so someone just put a question about industrial corridors and transit hubs, which is awesome timing, I think. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit and we can come back to it. So this is a case where the industrial is actually within the train station catchment area, but there's a lot of things that even if the train station wasn't here, they've done right to make this work. So one thing I've drawn, that 350-meter line. So from that collector road, the farthest back is 350 meters. So no one is going to be outside that transit walk shed for a local bus. The dashed red line, that shows what is actually a pedestrian trail along a small little riparian buffer. So you can travel between those larger industrial blocks and still come out on the collector roads to get your transit. And then, to make things even better, the spacing between those collector roads comes out to about 1.2 kilometers. Now, I've said 800 meters is a collector road spacing, but 1.2 kilometers is better than, the 3, 4, whatever kilometers we've seen in some of these examples. So again, even if you couldn't get there, they could run local service down to the collector roads. And in this case, there's actually going north-south. There is and I'm actually pointing at my screen, so I apologize. I'm trying to describe this as I point. But there is a collector road in the middle, so the spacing is actually 600 meters. I think someone mentioned industrial and transit corridors. I think one answer would be that TOD is not just about your higher order network. It's not just about your bus rapid transit or your frequent network or your rail lines. From my point of view, and one of the reasons I'm trying to show some kind of more smaller cities and some kind of peripheral areas, is that all uses should be reasonably transit oriented so that a local bus can get there without looping through things, so that there's a reasonable arrangement of the land uses and density so that that bus has some people to pick up. And I think if you were to look across all of the maritime cities that I can think of, such a huge area and so many people are in places that are just hostile to transit. And that is a fail. So thinking of TOD as a spectrum where you either hit it or don't is a bit problematic. It's a big spectrum where there's a gradient of decent local service to support people all the way up to your really heavy corridors. And so in industrial areas, I think aiming for good local service is often a worthy goal. And I'm going to show another example here of industrial area. So this is Toulouse, France, 1.3 million metro. So again, we're ballpark Ottawa, the 4th largest city in France. And the giant airport looking thing in the middle top is actually the bottom of Toulouse Airport. More importantly for our purposes, the headquarters of Airbus. Tens of thousands of people work there making airplanes. So I'm gonna go to the chat again, and just what do people think of this arrangement? Kind of just what you can see from here. We don't have the details, just your snap urban planning judgment. What do people think? Because this is industrial par excellence. You're making airplanes here and you're flying them out of it. Yeah, highway seems like a barrier. I would agree for sure. To a certain extent, the planners, this probably came about over decades. They may not have planned to put no one may have planned in a land use sense this Airbus headquarters going here. That would have probably been a very high level governmental decision. The highway seems like a barrier. Yep. There's a lot of parking is one thing I see. Do we see any potential direct routes? A lot of surface parking, easy for redevelopment options, okay? The surface parking, not great. I mean, this is an airport. There might be routes under the highway. Yeah, there are a lot of different routes under the highway, which is critical. When we're talking about permeability, it's at a lot of different scales, even at the kind of, I would call this maybe the neighborhood regional scale starting to come together, the city scale. Okay, I'm going to see what I saw. I'm going to put some ideas down here. I actually kind of like this. And yeah, that's huge. Kevin just said there's a lot of road access points, and that's pretty important. So again, we're talking about perhaps the most land hungry industrial use we can think of, but they're probably beating any industrial area in Atlantic Canada for transit access, to my mind. So here's actually the routes. What we've got here, we've got down coming from, actually, let's see if I can draw on this. Yeah, okay. So down here, people can see it. We got train station. And again, it's not directly within walking distance, but then we've got a route coming under the highway and running along the parking lots. Is that ideal? Is that going to make our transit-oriented design Hall of Fame? No, but again, we're grading on a curve here. This is the headquarters of Airbus. This pink line, to me, this is pretty straight, relatively, and it gets to the edge of the area, cuts down. Again, this is industrial down here. This is a rapid bus, so lots of frequency and some transit priority measures. And then we've got some other local routes kind of going through the area. And at this city scale, there's actually at the city scale, there's a pretty good mix of uses. The big industrial area, that's just going to be one thing. But we've got some sports fields. This is a main street, lots of housing, lots of housing. Is it amazing? Are we going to go on vacation and see this? Well, I might. I'm a pretty big transit nerd. But the transit goes right by it. Christopher Hardy right there. The transit appears to go right by it. It does. And it doesn't go right by it with giant detours. It just works. So, you know, not to belabor the point, there's a lot of things we can do better even in the toughest situations. And what it does require, though, is stepping back a bit from that idea of TOD as a specialized design and TOD as arranging our city and region well. So let's keep going. I think this is near the end. Uh-oh. Take the highlighter off. Okay, that was my second last slide anyways. So I'm pretty lucky. It seems to have frozen up again. So I'm going to turn it back over to, oh wait, there we go. I'm going to turn it back over to Marcus, and if there's questions, people can write them in the chat box, or if you want to speak up. I see that there's some here I haven't been able to get to.
Yeah, how about the affordability one? David Patterson asked a question that has really been on my mind a lot in the last couple of years. There's a tendency, because transit-oriented development is so pedestrian-oriented and compact and it kind of provides a real sense of place, and there's not a lot of it, that it commands higher prices because of its rarity and its sense of place. And then the rich and the stinking rich move in, and they own 2 or 3 cars, and they don't use the transit. Meanwhile, people who do use transit, who may be of a more moderate income or even low income, sometimes they get displaced. Any thoughts about how to address that, Sean? It's not an easy one, but it is important.
Yeah, it's really not. I think if you look at the really kind of world-beating super cities examples, I think, you know, Brooklyn is a really great example of that. Phenomenal transit service close to Manhattan, and it got in many areas very, very gentrified, pushing people who relied on that service farther out where it's not as easy to get around. I think there's a couple of things. I think first would be, think very carefully about your local service. And that's not the stuff that wins elections. It's not the stuff that makes most people jump around and get excited, but really great local service, which has good frequency, which has clear direct routes, which has decent, and I'm saying, like, you know, not Taj Mahal, but has good infrastructure for people to wait and transfer at. That is so important for many of the folks who aren't wealthy. People who really rely on transit often rely on the really great local service. And so one thing that's important, you can provide lots of local service to lots of areas. So you're diluting that TOD effect a little bit. You're saying, we are going to improve transit for lots of people. So I mean, I think from an HRM perspective, you'd have lots of places now that are lower income that would benefit from just better local service, which it's not gonna drive that TOD gentrification cycle as much. And then I think the second thing is just build as much housing and transit oriented stuff as you can,
Yeah.
because part of the problem is the rarity of,
Yes.
even in places like New York and Paris and London, like the rarity of really good urbanism has made it scarce. And to a certain extent, I mean, David, you're right. The more you improve access to a place, the more you make it expensive. That's urban economics. That's the whole reason for cities. But if there's more and more of it, and it's not like, ooh, we have four TOD urban new urbanist fantasy lands to choose from only. It's like, no, we have a lot of good different communities to choose from. I think that would help. It strikes me that if you look back at the era of the streetcar suburbs, or kind of when more cities were basically transit oriented or walking oriented mostly by default, it strikes me that it wasn't such a dichotomy just because there was so much more of it. But that's a partial answer to a really giant question. I see a question from Kevin here on smaller population centers that want to support TODs. And yeah, it's definitely difficult to do. I think I'm gonna think back to my example of Antigonish, because I know the town well, both from spending summers there, but also from going to university there. And they have a really great example of kind of a rural transit service where it's dial a ride that goes into all the rural highways and all the small rural communities around Antigonish and brings people into the core. So I think if you have a town the size of Antigonish, where realistically I can't see fixed route service being needed due to the size of the town, you can literally walk across it in 17 minutes probably. So unless you have a need for specialized transit service like a handy service or something like that. So I think what you really have to focus on in that case is trying to think of the whole town as a kind of a station area, where if you're coming in from a small rural dial-a-ride or something else, if you make it to the downtown and shopping districts, then you're there. I think that'd be very valuable. And I think the other thing that is not easily solved is thinking less about urban transit, but more about the interurban, the kind of city to city transit. And especially, I don't think there's much transit at all from Maritime Bus on the South Shore. There's relatively little interurban service in the Maritimes as is, compared to what I think there should be. So I think talking to your neighboring towns and talking to your MLAs and MPs about how do we get the inter-city service. And then I think for those towns lucky enough to have a big hospital or university, other than your main street, that's really going to be your focus. I think like those are going to be your bread and butter. So unless I missed any questions there, let's go back down here.
Just to end on a note of hope as well, Sean. Apparently, there's a coalition emerging of intercity motor coach companies across Canada that are banding together and coming up with a vision for coast to coast motor coach service. And they envisage, of course, there would have to be some sort of subsidy for it, but then the roads are subsidized too. You know, so there's that, and there's also the potential for if we ever see rail service return to the Maritimes post-COVID. And the interesting thing about rail is that it penetrates the traditional town centers, so you don't have to get on and off and on the freeway every time you want to make a stop, you know, in a center. So yeah, I appreciated you bringing out the rural and the interregional aspects of transit-oriented development, because those often get overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think you know, there's a role also for these dialer rides, which work well for dispersed areas of low volumes and short distances, for them to tie in to some kind of once or twice daily long haul rural route that will get you into the city for shopping or for work and back, a couple of choices back again. One of the things to remember is when you're planning a transit system, especially in a rural area, when you add even just adding one extra trip, it has a kind of a geometric accelerating impact effect or benefit in terms of the number of trip choices you then have. So if you have one round trip a day, you've got really no choices. But if you're 2 round trips a day, then you've got 4 possible choices of when to travel in either direction, in each direction. So that's another thing to think about when you're thinking about thinly populated areas, that even a small increase in frequency can have a real benefit in terms of the options available to people.
Yeah, I'm going to stay for a couple minutes if people have questions, and thank you everyone for coming along and asking questions and chatting through the chat. That was great. Yeah, I think Marcus, you nailed that. More trips are better, just from almost any point of view.
Right.
And one of the things that I think I'm becoming a little more bullish on dial of ride in low density dispersed areas, and we're talking quite low density, like below service level densities usually. I think because in many cases it's a question of going from symbolic hardly any transit or no transit to actually having the choice to leave relatively when you want to. And so that's just liberating. And I was reading about Belleville, Ontario, and one of the big things that Dial a Ride did there was it allowed them to have transit service at way more hours than a traditional fixed ride could. And so they were talking to a gentleman who said, I get up to work at 5 a.m. at the plant. I'm there at 5, and a fixed route running in Belleville, Ontario, population 50,000 and very dispersed, just would never made sense. So now there's actually transit for them, because so it's not just necessarily having a route. How often does that route operate? When does it operate? So there's definitely we have some powerful tools to bring transit to places that didn't have them before. But in terms of the places that have generally had transit in the past, it's still your bread and butter buses and other big vehicles. Yeah. So, and in that case, linearity just becomes so critical, because you want to be able to travel in a straight line relatively quickly to get where you're going. And we've built some road patterns that make that difficult, and I think we're all aware of that. So we need to stop. We gotta, sell council, sell developers, sell other professions, etc., on the value of those road connections. All right, I have one more thing to say, actually, for those of you still on. So it's my daughter's 8th birthday today, and she found out that I was doing this presentation, and she made me do it on her birthday. So happy birthday, Danielle. That's why it's April 15th. I thought that was hilarious. She was really excited about it, so it was great. Maybe she'll see it and hear the happy birthday.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was fascinating, and I liked the way you included a region-wide approach as well. It's something we often forget when we're thinking about transit-oriented communities.
Yeah.
And thank you all for showing up virtually, and happy birthday.
Yeah, birthday is just coming in. There we go.
Yeah, Danielle.
Oh, Danielle Gillen. Hello, Danielle. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Marcus.
All right. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.